The storm came without warning, the way ruin so often does. Eleanor Ashworth had gone out into the dusk for nothing more than a basket of feverfew, the herb her old nurse had sworn by for headaches, and she meant to be back before the first drop fell. She was always the one who went out in bad weather, the one who fetched things, the one who was sent because sending her cost nothing. Her sister Marianne never went out in the rain. Marianne's complexion was too fine for rain, her mother said, as though rain had ever asked permission before falling on a lovely face. Eleanor did not mind, or told herself she did not, which by 23 had become nearly the same thing. She was halfway across the low meadow that bordered Ashworth land, her cloak already soaked through, when she saw him. At first she thought it was a fallen branch, some dark shape thrown down by the wind. Then the shape moved, and she understood it was a man, and that he was not moving because he wished to, but because his body was fighting something it could not win alone. She should have run for her father. She should have called for the groundskeeper, or turned straight back toward the house and let someone with authority decide what to do about a strange man collapsed on Ashworth land in the middle of a storm. That would have been the sensible thing, the safe thing, the thing a well-bred young woman was supposed to do. Instead, Eleanor knelt in the mud beside him. His coat was fine once. She could see that even ruined and soaked as it was, though it had been mended in places with a careless hand, as if whoever wore it had learned to make do. His face was pale beneath several days' beard, his lips cracked, and when she pressed her palm to his forehead she drew back sharply, because he was burning despite the cold rain sheeting over them both. "Sir," she said, and shook his shoulder. "Sir, can you hear me?" His eyes opened, unfocused, dark with fever, and for one strange moment they found hers and held there, as though she were the only fixed point in a world that was spinning away from him. "Not the coast road," he murmured, so low she nearly lost it beneath the rain. "Tell them I did not take the coast road." Then his eyes closed again, and his head fell back, and Eleanor understood that whoever this man was, he was running from something, and that something might still be coming. She could not carry him. She was strong for a woman who spent her mornings in gardens and still rooms rather than drawing rooms, but he was tall, and unconscious men are heavier than the living ought to allow. So she did the only thing she could. She wedged her shoulder beneath his arm, and she dragged him, step by graceless step, toward the old gamekeeper's cottage that stood empty at the edge of the wood, because that was closer than the house, and because some instinct she could not yet name told her that this man could not be brought into her mother's hall. By the time she reached the cottage door her arms shook, and her breath tore in her chest, and she was drenched to the bone. And she had never in her life felt so certain that she was doing exactly what she was meant to do. She got the door open. She got him onto the narrow cot inside. And then, soaked and trembling, and entirely alone with an unconscious stranger, in a dead man's cottage, Eleanor Ashworth pressed her fingers to his throat and found his pulse fast and thin, and understood that if she did not act, and act quickly, he would very likely die. So she lit the fire herself, with hands that would not quite stop shaking. She stripped away his ruined coat, because wet wool against fever only worsened it, and she found beneath it, sewn into the lining with careful, expensive stitching, something she did not examine closely enough that night to understand its meaning. A small crest, half hidden, the kind of ornament that belonged to men whose names were spoken in rooms Eleanor Ashworth would never enter. She noticed it. She did not think about it. There was no room in her that night for anything but the fever burning through the stranger's skin, and the herbs she needed and did not have. She would come back before dawn with what she needed. She would tell no one. She could not have said why, except that something in the way he had spoken, not the coast road, tell them I did not take the coast road, told her that whoever was looking for him was not looking to help him. By the time she slipped back into the house soaked and shivering, her mother was already awake, already furious. "Where in heaven's name have you been?" Lady Ashworth demanded, holding a candle up as though its light might reveal the full extent of Eleanor's disgrace. "Do you know what hour it is? Your sister has been asking after you. We are to call on the Whitmores tomorrow, and you look as though you have been dragged through a hedge. I went for feverfew, Mother. I lost track of the storm." "You always lose track of something," Lady Ashworth said, not unkindly, which was somehow worse than cruelty, because it meant she had simply stopped expecting anything else. "Go and change before you catch your death. And Eleanor, do try to look presentable tomorrow. For Marianne's sake, if not your own." For Marianne's sake. Eleanor had heard some version of that sentence every week of her life, since she had been old enough to understand what it meant to be the plain one, the useful one, the one who was not expected to marry so much as to eventually disappear quietly into some cousin's household as an unpaid companion, grateful for the privilege. She went upstairs. She changed her gown. She lay awake until the grey hour before dawn, and then she rose again, took what herbs she could gather without waking the house, and went back out to the cottage in the wood, to the stranger whose name she did not know, and whose fever, when she reached him, had climbed higher still in the night. He was worse. Far worse. His skin had gone the colour of old parchment, and when she peeled back his shirt to press a cool cloth to his chest, she saw, just beneath his ribs, a wound that had not been made by any accident of weather. It was a clean, deliberate slice, days old and badly healed, the kind of wound made by a blade wielded with intent. Eleanor sat back on her heels and stared at it for a long moment. Whoever this man was, someone had tried to kill him, and whoever had tried had very nearly succeeded. "Then I suppose," she said quietly, to a man who could not hear her, "we had better see that they do not try again." It took 3 days before the fever broke. 3 days in which Eleanor invented a dozen small lies to explain her absences, a headache that required solitude, an interest in cataloguing the wildflowers along the old wood, a sudden devotion to sketching that kept her out until dusk. Her mother did not question these excuses closely, because her mother had long since stopped looking closely at anything Eleanor did. It was, for the first time in Eleanor's memory, useful to be overlooked. She fed him broth when he could swallow it, forcing it past cracked lips a spoonful at a time. She changed the dressing on the wound beneath his ribs, cleaning it with vinegar and yarrow the way her old nurse had taught her, back before her mother decided such knowledge was beneath a young lady of the house and better suited to the housekeeper. She sat with him through the worst of the fever, when he thrashed and murmured broken half-sentences in a voice roughened by delirium, names she did not recognize, a woman's name spoken once with something like grief, and again that same fragment, not the coast road. They will be watching the coast road. On the second night, in the depth of his fever, he seized her wrist with surprising strength and would not let go. "Don't let them find me," he said, his eyes open but not truly seeing her. "Please, not yet." "No one is going to find you," Eleanor told him, and meant it, though she had no earthly notion how she meant to keep such a promise. "You're safe. I have you." Something in his grip loosened at that, as if the words themselves had some power to calm him, and he sank back into sleep, and did not wake again until the fever finally broke near dawn on the third day. When his eyes opened this time, they were clear. He looked at her, really looked, taking in her plain grey gown, her hair coming loose from its pins, the exhaustion she knew must be written plainly on her face, and something in his expression shifted, careful and searching, as though he were trying to determine whether he had dreamed her. "Where am I?" His voice was a rasp, barely more than breath. "The old gamekeeper's cottage, on my father's land. You collapsed in the meadow 3 nights ago. You've been very ill." She reached for the cup of water she kept nearby and helped him drink, one hand steadying his head. "You should not try to speak yet." He drank. He watched her over the rim of the cup with an intensity that made her want to look away, and did not. "You brought me here yourself. There was no one else to bring you. And you've told no one I'm here." It was not quite a question, and something in the careful stillness with which he asked it confirmed what Eleanor had already begun to suspect. "No," she said. "I have not." "Why?" She considered the question longer than perhaps she needed to. "Because you asked me not to. In your fever, you begged me not to let them find you. I did not think a man says such things without cause." Something moved behind his eyes. Surprise, she thought, and beneath the surprise, something warmer, something that looked almost like the first stirrings of trust. "You are either very kind," he said slowly, "or very foolish, to hide a stranger from whatever hunts him without asking why." "Perhaps I am both," Eleanor said. "What is your name?" He hesitated. It was the barest fraction of a pause, but Eleanor, who had spent a lifetime learning to read the small silences of people who did not think her worth their full attention, caught it at once. "Alexander," he said finally. "Alexander Gray." She did not know then that a name could be both entirely true and entirely a lie at once. She only knew that something about the careful way he offered it told her not to press further, and so she did not. Though she filed the hesitation away, a small stone she would turn over later, in quieter moments. "Well, Mr. Gray," she said, "you are not yet strong enough to be hunted by anyone. You will stay here until you are, and you will let me tend that wound properly. And you will not thank me, because I did not do it to be thanked." The corner of his mouth curved, faint and involuntary, the first almost smile she had seen from him. "What did you do it for, then?" Eleanor considered this. "Because you were dying, and I could not walk past that and call myself decent." He looked at her for a long moment after that, in a way no one had ever quite looked at her before. Not with the polite dismissal she was used to, nor the pitying kindness her mother's friends sometimes offered the plain daughter, who would clearly need to make her own way, but with something that felt like genuine, careful attention, as if he were memorizing her. "Then I am fortunate," he said quietly, "that decency still exists somewhere in this county." Eleanor felt something warm bloom in her chest at that, unfamiliar and slightly alarming, and she busied herself with the dressing on his wound to avoid examining it too closely. It became, over the following days, a rhythm. She would slip away in the mornings under one pretext or another, and again in the evenings, and in between she managed the small performance of being Eleanor Ashworth, the overlooked second daughter, present at breakfast and absent from notice, dutiful at her mother's endless preparations for the coming season, when Marianne would be presented and admired and, everyone assumed, swiftly and advantageously married. "You have been strange lately," Marianne said to her one afternoon, studying her in the mirror, as their maid arranged her golden hair. Marianne was lovely in the effortless way that made other women's carefully cultivated beauty look like labor. Her hair caught the light without trying. Her laugh came easily. Her future had never once been in doubt. "Distracted. Where do you go? All those hours in the wood?" "Nowhere of interest," Eleanor said. Wildflowers, sketching, Marianne's reflection studied her a moment longer. Something almost thoughtful in her expression, which was unusual, because Marianne rarely troubled herself to think deeply about her sister at all. "You look happier than you have in a long while," she said finally. "It suits you, though Mother would have a fit if she knew you'd been tramping about unescorted. Then it is fortunate Mother does not know." Marianne laughed, surprised into it, and for a moment something like real warmth passed between them. A flicker of the closeness they might have had, if the world had not spent 2 decades teaching them to measure themselves against each other. "You're full of secrets suddenly, Nell. I don't know whether to be worried or intrigued." If only you knew, Eleanor thought, and said nothing at all. In the cottage, Alexander grew stronger by the day, and with strength came a restlessness Eleanor recognized as the particular impatience of a man unused to being confined, unused to needing anyone's help for anything. He was, she came to understand through careful observation rather than direct confession, a man of considerable education. He spoke of books she had only read about in her father's catalogues, quoted Latin without seeming to notice he had done so, and once, when she brought him a chessboard she had found gathering dust in the cottage's single cupboard, played with a precision and patience that suggested years of practice against opponents far more formidable than a country gentlewoman with only a passing knowledge of the game. "You are very good at this," she said, after he had beaten her soundly for the 3rd time in a row, though he had, she noticed, slowed his own play considerably to let her make a real contest of it. "Where did you learn?" He stopped, corrected himself, smoothly enough that she might have missed it, had she not been listening for exactly such small slips. "A tutor, in my youth." He had very little patience for a boy who could not sit still. "And can you sit still now?" "Apparently," he said, glancing down at the leg still healing beneath his blanket, "I have very little choice in the matter." She laughed, and he watched her laugh with an expression she was beginning to recognize, something between wonder and hunger, as though laughter were a rare commodity in whatever life he had left behind, and he meant to store up as much of it as he could before circumstance took it from him again. It was in the 2nd week, when he was strong enough to sit upright unaided and take short, careful steps across the cottage floor, that Eleanor noticed the ring. He kept it hidden most days, tucked into an inner pocket of the coat she had cleaned and mended for him. But she saw it once when he thought her occupied at the hearth, a heavy gold signet, engraved with a crest she did not recognize, though something about its weight and craftsmanship told her plainly that it belonged to no ordinary gentleman. She said nothing of it, but that night, walking back to the house in the last grey light of evening, she turned the small stone over in her mind at last. All the little inconsistencies she had gathered and set aside, the fine if ruined tailoring of his coat, the Latin he did not seem to know he spoke, the crest sewn into his lining, the signet ring, the careful way he chose his words whenever the conversation turned toward his past, and she understood, with a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air, that Alexander Grey was not merely a gentleman fallen on hard circumstance. He was hiding something far larger than a name. She did not confront him with it. Some instinct told her that a man running for his life did not surrender his secrets to a stranger, however kind that stranger had been, until he trusted her with more than his gratitude. And so she waited, and she tended him, and she told herself that whatever he was hiding, it changed nothing about the man she had come to know in that small cottage, patient with her clumsy chess, gentle in his questions about her life, quietly, fiercely attentive whenever she spoke of the things she loved, her herbs, her books, the small freedoms she had carved out for herself in a house that valued her chiefly for her usefulness. "You speak of your sister often," he observed one evening, as she changed the dressing on his healing wound, her fingers steady now with practice. "But rarely of yourself. Why is that?" "There is little to say. Marianne is the one who will be admired this season. I am the one who will hand her gloves and smooth her hem and be grateful for the privilege of watching her succeed. That is not an answer. That is a role you have been given. I asked what you think of yourself." Eleanor's hands stilled for a moment over the linen bandage. No one had ever asked her that question so plainly before, not her mother, who had long ago decided the answer did not matter, not her father, too gentle and too absent to trouble himself with either daughter's inner life, not even Marianne, who loved her in the careless way of someone who had never had to fight for anything, and so did not think to wonder what fighting cost. "I think," she said slowly, "that I know more about healing a wound than any physician my mother would trust, and more about the properties of every plant in this county than any man who has been to university, and that none of it will matter in the least, because what is wanted of me is a pleasant face and a small dowry, and I possess neither in sufficient quantity." "You possess a great deal more than that," Alexander said, and something in his voice had gone low and serious, entirely without the careful lightness he usually kept between them. "You saved my life. You have kept me hidden and safe, with nothing to gain from it but risk to yourself. You have wit enough to nearly beat me at chess, though I suspect you let me win more often than I let you, and you have a kindness in you that does not ask what it might receive in return. If the men of your acquaintance cannot see the value in that, then the fault lies with their sight, not your worth." Eleanor did not trust herself to speak for a long moment. She busied herself with the last of the bandage, tying it off with hands that were not entirely steady. "You should not say such things to me," she said finally, quietly. "It makes it very difficult to remember that you will be gone from here soon, and that I ought not to grow accustomed to hearing them." Something flickered across his face. Regret, she thought, or perhaps something closer to dread. Eleanor, it was the first time he had used her given name, and it landed between them with unexpected weight. "There are things about my circumstances I have not told you, things I cannot yet tell you, for your own protection as much as mine. But I want you to know that nothing I have said to you in this cottage has been false. Whatever else I am, whatever I must eventually explain to you, that much has been entirely true." "Then tell me what you can," she said. "Even a little truth would be more than I have had from most people in my life." He was quiet for a long moment, and she watched him weigh something behind his eyes, some calculation of risk she could not follow. "I am running from an arrangement," he said finally. "A marriage that was decided for me by people who care nothing for whether I wish it, for reasons of state and family obligation that have nothing to do with affection. I left rather than submit to it. Someone did not want me to succeed in leaving." His hand moved, unconsciously, to the healing wound beneath his ribs. "That is the truth, as much of it as I can safely give you. I promise you the rest, when I am able." Eleanor absorbed this slowly. A marriage arranged. Men who would kill rather than let him refuse it. It painted a picture far larger and far more dangerous than she had allowed herself to imagine. And yet it also, strangely, made him more human to her rather than less. A man trapped by obligations not of his choosing, just as she was trapped by her mother's expectations and her family's diminishing fortune, just in a much higher and more perilous register. "Then I hope," she said softly, "that you find whatever freedom you are looking for." "I begin to think," he said, watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch, "that I may have already found something I was not looking for at all, and did not know I needed until I found it." The words hung between them, dangerous and unspoken further, and Eleanor rose rather too quickly and busied herself banking the fire, because she did not trust what her face might reveal if she let herself meet his eyes any longer. There was, too, a complication Eleanor had not anticipated, and it arrived in the shape of Mr. Julian Farrow, a gentleman of good family and better fortune who had begun, that same fortnight, to call at Ashworth Hall with unmistakable intentions toward Marianne. He was handsome, well-spoken and connected, through a distant cousin, to certain circles at court, connections that made Lady Ashworth glow with satisfaction every time his carriage appeared in the drive. Eleanor thought little of him at first, beyond a passing relief that her mother's attention had found a fresh and worthier object than her own comings and goings. But on the evening he stayed to dine, she noticed him watching her with a curiosity that had nothing to do with courtesy. "You seem often absent these days, Miss Ashworth," he said over the soup, in a tone light enough to pass for idle conversation. Your mother tells me you have taken up sketching in the wood. Rather solitary pursuit for a young lady, is it not? I find solitude agrees with me, Mr. Farrow. I confess I heard something rather more colourful in the village, he said, watching her over the rim of his glass. That a gentleman was seen, some weeks past, thrown from his horse near your father's land, injured and never accounted for since. The innkeeper's boy swears he saw a stranger carried off toward the wood in a storm. Eleanor kept her expression carefully even, though her pulse had quickened considerably. The village manufactures a good deal of colourful talk, sir, particularly when the harvest is thin and there is little else to occupy it. No doubt, Farrow said, smiling in a way that did not reach his eyes, and let the subject drop, though Eleanor caught him watching her twice more before the evening ended, and left the dinner with the uneasy sense that she had made, without quite meaning to, a very dangerous kind of acquaintance. She said nothing of it to Alexander for 2 days, unwilling to add to whatever weight he already carried, but when at last she did, his reaction confirmed every instinct that had troubled her. Farrow, he repeated, his jaw tightening. I know the name. He is no innocent gossip, Eleanor. His family holds a debt of gratitude to my uncle going back a generation, and he has visited Havering's estate more than once this past year. If he suspects I am here, he will not keep the knowledge to himself out of kindness. He will carry it straight to the one man in the kingdom who most wants me found before I can tell my own story. Then we must be more careful. We must be more than careful. If he is watching you to find me, then anything that draws his notice to your movements becomes a danger, to you as much as to me. He reached for her hand, his grip urgent. Eleanor, I would rather surrender myself to my uncle's men this very hour than see harm come to you for my sake. And I have already told you, she said, steady despite the fear coiling in her chest, that I did not drag you out of a storm merely to abandon you to the first threat that appeared afterward. We will simply have to be cleverer than Mr. Farrow, that is all. It proved, in the end, rather harder than either of them hoped. Farrow began to appear at odd hours, ostensibly courting Marianne but contriving reasons to wander the grounds, to ask idle questions of the gardeners, to remark, with studied casualness, upon the old gamekeeper's cottage, and whether anyone still had use of it. Eleanor grew practised at misdirection, at inventing errands that led her conspicuously away from the wood whenever Farrow's carriage was in the drive, and at enduring Marianne's puzzled hurt when her sister seemed, of late, so strangely evasive and preoccupied. You have grown secretive with me, Nell, Marianne said one evening, braiding her own hair before the glass with more force than the task required. We used to tell each other everything, when we were girls. Now I hardly know where you go, or who occupies your thoughts so entirely that you cannot spare a moment for your own sister. The words struck harder than Marianne likely intended, because they carried a grain of real hurt beneath the complaint, and Eleanor felt the familiar ache of choosing, again between honesty and safety. It is not that I do not trust you, she said carefully. It is that what I carry just now is not safe to share, even with someone I love. I promise you, Marianne, when I am able to tell you everything, you will understand why I could not tell you sooner. Marianne studied her for a long moment in the mirror, and something in her expression softened, the old childhood closeness flickering briefly back to life beneath the season's competing pressures. Whatever it is, she said quietly, I hope it makes you happy. You deserve that much, Nell, whatever Mother says about duty and dowries. You always have. It was the first time in years either sister had spoken so plainly to the other, and Eleanor carried the warmth of it with her, long after the candle was extinguished, a small unlooked-for comfort against the danger gathering, unseen, just beyond the edges of her carefully guarded days. It was 3 days after that conversation that everything began to unravel. Eleanor arrived at the cottage in the grey hour after dawn to find Alexander already dressed, pacing the small room with an energy that told her his strength had fully returned, and with it, whatever urgency had been driving him before the fever felled him in her meadow. "There were riders on the road last night," he said without preamble, before she had even closed the door behind her. "I heard them from the window. Men asking after a gentleman travelling alone, wounded, answering to no name they could confirm." Eleanor felt the cold drop of fear she had been holding at bay for 2 weeks finally land in her stomach. "Here?" "Asking at Ashworth Land, not directly, not yet. But they are searching the county, and it will not be long before they think to ask at every great house within a day's ride." He turned to face her, and the careful gentleness she had grown used to in him had hardened into something more urgent, more commanding. A glimpse, she realized, of whatever authority he carried in the life he had fled. "I have put you in danger simply by remaining here. If they find me under your father's roof, however unofficial my presence, the scandal alone could ruin your family, to say nothing of what men willing to put a blade in me might do to anyone who has helped me hide." "Then what do you mean to do?" "I mean to leave. Tonight, if I can manage the road. I have imposed on your kindness far longer than I had any right to." Something in Eleanor's chest cracked at the flat finality of it, and she hated herself a little for how much it hurt. For a man she had known barely a fortnight, a man whose true name she still did not fully possess. "You are not yet strong enough for the road," she said, though she knew even as she said it that it was only half the truth of her objection. "I have very little choice." "You always have a choice," she said, sharper than she intended. "You are choosing to leave rather than let anyone else share the risk of your staying. That is not the same as having no options." He looked at her for a long moment, something raw and unguarded moving across his face. "You are correct," he admitted, "but if I stay, and they find me, I will have brought ruin down upon the one person in this whole miserable business who has asked nothing of me and given everything freely. I cannot allow that. Not you. Not after," he stopped himself, jaw tight. "After what?" "After I have come to care for you," he said, low and rough. The words dragged out of him, as though they cost him something. "More than any arrangement, any obligation, any danger I am fleeing has any right to make wise. I did not intend it. I certainly did not plan for it. But it has happened regardless, and I will not repay it by letting harm come to you for my sake." Eleanor stood very still, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain he must hear it. No one had ever spoken to her like that, not with the practiced flattery young men sometimes offered Marion, empty compliments traded for advantage, but with the raw, unwilling honesty of a man confessing something he had fought against and lost. "Then stay," she said, before she could think better of it, "and let me help you properly. Not hidden in a cottage like a fugitive, but let me speak to my father. He is a gentle man, and just. If you tell him even half of what you have told me, he will not turn you over to men who mean you harm. Eleanor, you do not know my father will refuse you until you have asked." He studied her for a long moment, some internal battle playing out behind his eyes, and Eleanor watched hope and fear war visibly across his features. "If I tell your father who I am," he said slowly, "it will change everything between us. You must understand that, whatever this has been, between the two of us, in this small, forgotten cottage, it will not survive contact with the truth unaltered. I need you to understand that before I risk it." The warning in his voice frightened her more than the riders on the road had. "What is your name?" she asked again, steady this time, refusing to be deflected. "Your true name. I think I have earned that much at least." He closed his eyes briefly, as though gathering courage for a leap he had been circling for 2 weeks. "My name is Alexander," he said. That much was true. "Alexander Rhys Ashvale, Marquess of Denholm." He paused, and the next words came quieter, heavier, as though each one were a stone he was setting down with great care. "I am cousin to His Royal Highness the Prince. and I was fleeing a marriage arranged by my family and sanctioned by the crown itself, to a foreign princess I have never met, and do not wish to marry. The men hunting me were sent, I believe, by my own uncle, who stands to gain a great deal should the marriage proceed, and rather less should I succeed in refusing it." The room seemed to tilt very slightly around Eleanor. She had suspected wealth. She had suspected rank, even some minor lordship fallen on hard times. She had not imagined this. A man so close to the crown itself that his marriage was a matter of state, hunted by his own family for daring to want something other than duty. "You are the prince's cousin," she repeated, faintly, as though saying it aloud might make it easier to comprehend. "I am. And you let me." She stopped, mortification washing hot and sudden through her. "I scolded you over losing at chess. I lectured you about sitting still. I brought you broth in a chipped cup because it was all the cottage had, and I never once— Alexander, I have been speaking to you this whole fortnight as though you were an ordinary man." "You have been speaking to me," he said, closing the distance between them, "as though I were simply a man, full stop, without regard for title or rank or the accident of my birth, which is precisely why these have been the only truly honest weeks of my entire life, and precisely why I find myself unwilling to let them end, simply because you now know the truth of who I am." He reached for her hand, and she let him take it, though her mind was still reeling. "Nothing has changed in what I feel for you, Eleanor. I would understand entirely if something has changed in what you feel for me." Eleanor looked down at their joined hands, his fingers still faintly marked by the wound she had nursed, and felt something in her chest settle even as everything else remained in turmoil. "I do not know what I feel," she said honestly, "only that it does not vanish simply because you have a title I did not know of. But Alexander, if this is true, if you are who you say, then I do not see how it can end well. Men like you do not marry women like me. It is not merely unlikely. It is nearly impossible. Nothing about the last fortnight has been likely," he said quietly, "and yet here we are." It was, in the end, her father who first learned the truth, and not by design. Eleanor had meant to prepare the ground carefully, to find some private moment to explain the situation before any confrontation could occur, but circumstance moved faster than her caution. 2 days after Alexander's confession, a party of 6 riders arrived at Ashworth Hall itself, their leader presenting himself as an officer of the Crown's household, requesting, with the particular courtesy of men who could very easily stop requesting and start demanding, permission to search the grounds for a missing nobleman believed to be travelling, injured, somewhere in the county. Eleanor watched from an upstairs window as her father received them in the drive, his face growing paler by the moment as the officer explained, in careful terms, precisely whose cousin they sought, and precisely how displeased certain persons at court would be should any assistance to him be discovered and concealed. She did not wait to hear more. She ran. She found Alexander already alert to the danger, standing at the cottage window watching the distant activity at the house, through the trees, his expression grim. "They are here," she said, breathless from running. "My father is speaking with them now. Alexander, if they search the wood, I know." He turned from the window, and something had settled in him, some resolve she had not seen before, quiet and certain. "I will not let your father be made to answer for concealing me, nor will I let you bear the consequences of what has only ever been my own risk to carry. It is time I stopped hiding." "What do you mean to do?" "I mean to walk out of these woods and present myself," he said, "and tell the truth of what happened, that I collapsed on Ashworth land in a storm, and that your family showed me a kindness they had no obligation to show a stranger, and that whatever consequence follows from my flight belongs to me and to my uncle's ambitions, and to no one else." Fear, sharp and sudden, closed around Eleanor's heart. "And if your uncle's men do not care for such distinctions, if they mean you harm regardless of who witnesses it, then at least it will not be your family's ruin alongside my own. He crossed the small distance between them and took her hands in his grip firm and warm. Eleanor, whatever happens in the next hour, I need you to know that everything I told you 2 nights past was true, and remains true, and will remain true whatever title or crown or arranged marriage attempts to stand between us. I love you. I did not plan it, and I certainly did not deserve to be shown such kindness by a woman I had given no reason to trust me. But it has happened, entirely and completely, and I do not intend to let it go quietly, whatever else I must surrender. Eleanor's breath caught, the words landing in her chest like something both wonderful and terrible, arriving at precisely the moment she was least equipped to answer them. Alexander, you need not answer now. Only know that it is true. He pressed a kiss to her knuckles, brief and fierce, and then released her hands and turned toward the door, his shoulders squaring into something that looked, for the first time since she had dragged him half-conscious from the meadow, entirely like a man born to command a room rather than hide from one. Wait, Eleanor said. Let me come with you. Whatever is said, I would rather stand beside you and hear it than wait here imagining the worst. He looked at her for a long moment, something fierce and grateful moving across his face, and then he nodded once. Then come. They walked out of the wood together, and the men in the drive turned as one to watch them approach, Eleanor Ashworth, mud-hemmed and windswept, and beside her a tall, gaunt gentleman whose bearing, once he straightened to his full height and let 2 weeks of hidden authority settle back onto his shoulders, made every man in that drive fall silent and, a heartbeat later, bow, my lord. The officer said, and the title landed on the assembled household like a thunderclap. Eleanor's mother, who had come out onto the front steps at the commotion, went perfectly white. Marianne, beside her, simply stared, her mouth slightly open, taking in the scene with an expression of dawning, disbelieving comprehension. Sir Ashworth, still standing where he had first greeted the riders, looked from the officer's bow to his own daughter, standing calm and unbowed beside a man the entire county would soon know as cousin to the crown itself, and something like understanding, slow and enormous, began to dawn across his features. I owe your household an explanation, Alexander said, his voice carrying easily across the drive, pitched for every listening ear, and an apology for the deception, however necessary it seemed at the time. I am Alexander Ashvale, Marquess of Denholm. 2 weeks ago I fled an arranged marriage I did not consent to, and was set upon on the road by men in my own uncle's employ, who left me for injured and would, I do not doubt, have left me for dead had fortune not placed your daughter in that meadow during the worst of the storm. He turned then, and looked at Eleanor with an open, unguarded warmth that made the breath catch in every throat watching them. Miss Eleanor Ashworth found me half dead in the rain, he continued, and rather than leave me to whatever fate my pursuers intended, she carried me to shelter, tended a wound that would very likely have killed me left untreated, and nursed me through a fever that by rights ought to have taken my life, all while telling no one, risking her own reputation and her family's standing, because, in her own words to me, she could not walk past a dying man and call herself decent. His voice roughened slightly on the last words. I owe her my life. I intend to spend the rest of it attempting to be worthy of that debt. The silence that followed was absolute. Eleanor felt every eye in the drive turned toward her, her mother's stunned, her father's wondering, Marianne's for once entirely without envy, only a kind of startled awe, and she stood very still beneath the weight of it, this woman who had spent her entire life being looked past, now suddenly and entirely seen. My lord, her father managed finally, I confess I hardly know what to say. Say that you will permit me to call properly, Alexander said, once the matter of my uncle's ambitions has been settled, as it will be settled, and settled decisively. "I have no wish to hide any longer, not my name, not my history, and certainly not my regard for your daughter, which I intend to make known to the entire kingdom if that is what it takes to prove it is real." It was not, in the end, so simply resolved. Alexander's uncle, Lord Havering, did not surrender his ambitions merely because his nephew had reappeared, publicly and defiantly, at a minor country estate. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor watched from a strange and uncomfortable distance as Alexander was drawn back into the machinery of court, summoned to explain his flight to the prince himself, forced to account for a broken betrothal that had been years in the careful construction, obliged to face down accusations, orchestrated by his uncle's allies, that his story of attempted murder was mere invention to cover a young lord's cowardice before an unwanted marriage. He wrote to her when he could, brief letters smuggled by riders he trusted, full of frustration and longing, and a steady, unwavering promise that he had not changed his mind, whatever delays and dangers the court forced between them. But letters were cold comfort against her mother's sudden, dizzying reversal. Lady Ashworth, who had spent 20 years scarcely noticing her second daughter, now fluttering about Eleanor with an attentiveness so transparently mercenary that Eleanor found it almost harder to bear than the old neglect. "You must understand, my dear," her mother said one evening, arranging and rearranging the same 3 gowns across Eleanor's bed, as though sheer repetition might improve their quality, "that everything has changed now. You must be seen to advantage. The whole county will be watching to see whether the Marquess truly returns for you, and we cannot have you looking as though, well, as though you have spent the last 2 years unremarked. I have spent the last 2 years unremarked, mother, because I was permitted to be nothing else." Lady Ashworth had the grace, at least, to look briefly uncomfortable at that, though the discomfort did not last long enough to alter her behavior. Worse than her mother's sudden interest was the whisper campaign that began to circulate once word of the affair reached wider society, that Eleanor Ashworth had schemed to trap a nobleman, had perhaps even engineered the entire encounter, had certainly used a vulnerable, fevered man's confusion to secure an advantageous match no respectable woman ought to have pursued so boldly. Lord Havering's allies, Eleanor suspected, though she could never prove it, finding it convenient to cast doubt on the woman who stood between the Marquis and the marriage that would have profited them so handsomely. It reached its cruelest point at a dinner given by the Whitmores, to which the Ashworths had been invited chiefly, Eleanor understood, so that the assembled company might examine the young woman at the centre of the scandal for themselves. "It is remarkable," said Mrs. Whitmore, with the particular smiling cruelty of a woman who considers herself too well bred to be openly unkind, "how quickly some young ladies discover a talent for nursing when the patient happens to be worth a marquisate." The table's laughter was polite, restrained, and utterly devastating. Eleanor felt her face heat, felt the old familiar instinct to shrink, to apologize for existing too visibly, rise up in her exactly as it always had. And then, for the first time in her life, she did not yield to it. "I confess I did not know his rank when I found him," Eleanor said, her voice steady though her heart hammered, "only that he was dying in the rain. And I could not in conscience leave him to it. I did not nurse him for 2 weeks in hope of a title, Mrs. Whitmore, because for the better part of that fortnight I believed him to be nothing more than a penniless traveller with a fever and a bad wound. If you mean to suggest that decency is only worth exercising when there is profit attached to it, I confess that says a good deal more about your own principles than it does about mine." The table fell silent. Somewhere near the foot of it, Eleanor caught her father's eye, and saw in his expression something she had rarely seen there before, unmistakable, quiet pride. Mrs. Whitmore, for her part, had no ready answer, and the conversation moved hastily on to safer ground. But Eleanor understood. Sitting very straight in her chair, with her heart still pounding, that something in her had shifted permanently. She had spent her whole life being spoken over, spoken past, spoken about as though her own account of herself mattered less than everyone else's convenient version of her. She did not intend to permit it any longer. Marquess or no Marquess, the hardest week of all came near the end of that long separation, when a rumour reached Ashworth Hall by way of a London newspaper Mrs. Whitmore took particular delight in sending over, folded open to the relevant column, that the Marquess of Denholm had been seen at a court ball on the arm of Lady Caroline Fenwick, a celebrated beauty whose family had long sought precisely such a connection, and that an announcement of some significance was rumoured to be imminent. Eleanor read the notice 3 times before she trusted herself to set it down without her hands shaking. "You must not credit a word of it," her father said gently, finding her still seated with the paper long after supper had ended. "Such columns thrive on invention, my dear. You know that better than anyone." "I know it," Eleanor said, "and yet I find knowing it does very little to steady me." She had received no letter from Alexander in nearly 3 weeks, the longest silence since his departure, and the newspaper's cruel timing settled into that silence like poison into a wound, finding every crack her courage had left unguarded. She thought of the fever nights in the cottage, of his hand gripping hers in the dark, of the words he had spoken in the drive before the whole assembled household. She told herself those things could not simply cease to be true, because a London column wished to sell more papers. But doubt, once let in, is a patient and thorough guest, and it kept her poor company through several long nights that followed. She did not write to reproach him. She would not, she decided, be the sort of woman who doubted a man on the word of a gossip column rather than his own account. But she also found she could no longer quite trust the easy certainty she had carried through the earlier weeks of waiting, and something in her braced itself. Quietly and privately, for a disappointment she refused to name aloud even to herself. It was Marianne, in the end, who set the rumour properly to rest, arriving breathless in Eleanor's room one morning with a letter of her own, sent by a school friend now attached to a household at court. She says the ball was nothing more than a formal court occasion he could not decently avoid. Marianne reported, thrusting the letter into Eleanor's hands, and that he danced precisely one dance with Lady Caroline, as courtesy required of him toward his hostess's niece, and spent the whole of the rest of the evening looking, in my friend's own words, thoroughly wretched and entirely elsewhere in his thoughts. She says half the court has already remarked how plainly lovesick he seems for someone who is decidedly not present at any of these occasions. Marianne squeezed her sister's hand, her eyes bright. "It is you, Nell. It has been you all along. Whatever that dreadful column implied, I do not believe for a moment that man's heart has strayed an inch." Relief came so suddenly and so completely that Eleanor had to sit down. "I ought not to have doubted him," she said quietly, ashamed of how quickly the old fear of being overlooked, of being merely convenient rather than truly chosen, had risen up to swallow her certainty. "You doubted a rumour, not the man," Marianne said, with a gentleness that surprised them both. "That is not the same thing at all. I think, after a lifetime of being told you were the sister no one would especially miss, some small doubting is only natural. But I have watched him look at you, Eleanor. I have never in my life seen a man look at anyone the way the Marquess of Denholm looks at you. Whatever that newspaper wishes to invent, it cannot invent that away." A letter arrived from Alexander himself only 2 days later. Delayed, he explained, by the sudden and complicated business of finally formally dismantling his uncle's schemes before the full council of the prince's advisers. A letter so full of frustration at the enforced silence, and longing for her company, and fierce, unwavering constancy, that Eleanor wept over it in a manner entirely unlike her usual careful composure, and forgave herself, at last, for the week of doubt the distance and the cruelty of gossip had cost her. It was nearly 2 months before Alexander returned to Ashworth Land, and when he did, Eleanor very nearly did not recognize him at first, so altered was his bearing from the fevered, hunted man she had dragged from the meadow. He arrived with a modest retinue, dressed in the unmistakable, understated richness of a man secure in his own position, and yet the moment his eyes found her, standing on the front steps in the same plain grey gown she had worn 100 times before, something in his face softened into an expression that had nothing to do with rank at all. "You look," he said, crossing the drive toward her without any apparent regard for the assembled watchers, "exactly as I remembered you. I confess I feared the last 2 months might have changed that." "The last 2 months have been rather trying," Eleanor admitted. "Your uncle's friends have taken a great interest in my character. I know. I am sorry for it, more than I can easily say. It is partly why I have been so long in returning. I would not come to you until the matter with my uncle was entirely and publicly resolved, so that no lingering doubt could be cast on either of us." His expression turned grim for a moment. "It is resolved now. My uncle's role in the attempt on my life, and his manipulation of the betrothal for his own gain, has been laid before the prince and confirmed. He has been stripped of his position at court, and his lands are forfeit. The betrothal to the foreign princess has been formally and permanently dissolved, at my own request and, I am given to understand, rather to her relief as well, as she had no more wish for the match than I did." Relief, sharp and dizzying, washed through Eleanor. "Then you are free." "I am free," he confirmed, "to do precisely what I have wished to do since the moment I woke in that cottage and found you sitting beside me, half drowned, and entirely unbothered by my rank, because you did not yet know I had any." He reached into his coat and drew out a small box, and Eleanor's breath caught entirely. The assembled household and Ashworth family, and even the distant curious servants fading into irrelevance around the two of them. "Eleanor Ashworth, you saved my life without knowing what it was worth to anyone but you. You loved me, for I believe you do, whatever caution has kept you from saying it plainly, without knowing what it might cost you or gain you either way. I have met a great many people in my life who wanted something from me. You are the only one who ever simply wanted me. Plain Alexander Gray with a bad fever and an unremarkable cottage, and I find I cannot conceive of a life that does not include that particular, extraordinary kindness at the center of it. Will you marry me?" Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, at the man she had first seen collapsed and dying in a storm, and now stood before her whole and certain and utterly transformed by nothing more than the return of his own freedom, and felt the last of her old caution, the old habit of expecting to be overlooked, finally and completely dissolve. "Yes," she said, and the word came out clear and unhesitating, carrying easily across the drive to where her mother stood frozen in open-mouthed astonishment, and her father's face had broken into something that looked remarkably like tears held carefully in check. "Yes, Alexander, I will." He kissed her then, in full view of the entire household, without the slightest regard for propriety, and Eleanor kissed him back with equal disregard, because she had spent a lifetime being careful, being modest, being the sort of quiet, unremarked young woman who did not draw attention to herself, and she found, in that single unguarded moment, that she was thoroughly and happily finished with all of it. Their wedding, when it came that autumn, was not the grand court spectacle Alexander's rank might have commanded, though the prince himself attended and pronounced the union a fine match indeed, one that reflected rather better on the family's judgment than the marriage his uncle had schemed to arrange. It was held instead at the small parish church nearest Ashworth Hall, in the presence of the people who had actually known Eleanor before the world discovered she was worth knowing. Her father, radiant with a pride he had never before had cause to display so openly. Marianne, who had surprised everyone, including herself, by becoming her sister's fiercest defender through the worst of the gossip, and who cried through the entire ceremony with unashamed delight. Even her mother, chastened in some genuine if imperfect way by watching her overlooked daughter become, in the end, the most remarkable woman in the county. Standing at the altar, her hand in Alexander's, Eleanor thought of the storm that had brought them together, and of all the small, unremarked kindnesses that had led her out into that meadow in the first place. The years of being sent because sending her cost nothing, the years of learning herbs and healing because no one thought to stop her, the years of quiet dignity maintained in rooms that rarely troubled to notice it. None of it had been wasted, she understood now. Every overlooked hour had been building, quietly and without her knowledge, toward precisely the moment when a dying stranger needed exactly the woman she had, all along and without anyone's particular encouragement, chosen to become. "I love you," Alexander murmured, for her ears alone, as the vicar began the final words of the ceremony. "Not the Marquess's wife you will now be. You, only and always you." "I know," Eleanor said, smiling through sudden tears of her own. "I have known it since the fever broke, and you looked at me as though I were something worth seeing at all." Outside, the autumn sun broke fully through the clouds, warm and unhurried. Nothing at all like the storm that had first thrown them together. And Eleanor Ashworth, soon to be Eleanor Ashvale, Marchioness of Denholm, though she suspected she would always, in her own private heart, think of herself simply as the woman who had once knelt in the mud beside a dying stranger and refused to walk away, stepped out into the light on her husband's arm, finally and entirely seen,